The metal was cold against her temple. It was the only thing she could feel with any certainty. The rest was a blur of noise. The clatter of a dropped fork, a woman's muffled sob from a booth near the kitchen, the frantic, high-pitched demands of the man holding the gun. He smelled of cheap cigarettes and desperation. His voice cracked on the word money, betraying the bravado of the black ski mask and the steady pressure of the pistol. She was supposed to be afraid. Her heart was supposed to be a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. But all she felt was a profound and terrible calm. She had seen this movie before. She knew how it ended. He would get the cash from the register, maybe a few wallets, and he would be gone. Panic was a luxury, an indulgence that got people hurt. So she breathed. In through her nose, out through her mouth. Slow. Deliberate. The way her father had taught her. The man in the corner booth had not moved. Not when the robber had first stormed in. Not when the gun was pointed at her. She had noticed him when he'd walked in an hour earlier. His suit was dark wool, cut so perfectly it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. He drank his black coffee without a word, his stillness a pocket of silence in the noisy diner. Now, in the chaos, his silence had weight. It was a physical presence in the room. However, it was not the gun in her face or the silent, watching man that set her teeth on edge. It was the sloppy way the robber held his weapon. His grip was wrong. His thumb was in the wrong place. He was an amateur, and amateurs were unpredictable. Amateurs made mistakes. She could not afford his mistakes. That is when she decided to speak. The cold metal of the gun barrel was a single, anchoring point in a world gone sideways. Around her, the late-night hum of the diner had curdled into a thick, choking silence, punctuated only by the robber's ragged breathing and the soft weeping of Mrs. Gable from Table 3. The air, usually thick with the smell of coffee and fried onions, now smelled of sweat and fear. The register. The man in the ski mask rasped, his voice a raw nerve. Now. Chloe kept her eyes on his. Or where she imagined his eyes would be behind the cheap black fabric. She did not look at the gun. You never look at the gun. You look at the man holding it. You make him see you as a person, not an obstacle. It was the first rule. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her hands raised slightly, palms open.
Non threatening.
Her worn sneakers made no sound on the checkered linoleum floor. Every head in the diner was down, every customer trying to melt into the red vinyl of their booths. Except one. In the far corner, the man in the perfect suit sat as still as a statue carved from shadows. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't moved to hide. He was simply watching her, his dark eyes unreadable from across the room. A tumbler of amber liquid sat untouched beside his coffee cup. He was an island of absolute calm in a sea of terror, and his stillness was somehow more frightening than the gun. Chloe reached the register. The keys were old, worn smooth from years of use. She pressed the button, and the drawer shot open with a familiar, cheerful chime that sounded obscene in the tense silence. Inside, there was less than $200. A pathetic sum for this much trouble. Put in the bag, the robber ordered, shoving a flimsy plastic bag toward her. She began to pull the bills from their slots. Tens. Fives. A sad little stack of ones. Her movements were fluid, unhurried. She was not stalling. She was thinking. She noted the tremor in his hand, the way his knuckles were white. He was more scared than she was. That was dangerous. That's when she saw it. A small detail she almost missed. Peeking out from under the cuff of his black jacket, on the pale skin of his wrist, was the tail of a tattooed snake. It was poorly done, the lines blurry, the ink a faded green. But the design was specific. A coiled serpent eating its own tail, with a single star in the center. Her blood went cold. It was a cold that had nothing to do with the gun, and everything to do with that cheap, ugly tattoo. She knew that tattoo. She knew what it meant. She knew who it belonged to. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was not a random robbery. This was a message. And the man in the corner booth was the intended recipient. This changed everything. This was no longer about a frightened amateur and $200. This was about territory. It was about men like the one in the corner, men who drank whiskey at 2 in the morning and wore silence like armor. Men who did not tolerate messages being sent in their presence. She stopped moving. Her hand hovered over the last stack of ones. "What are you doing?" the robber hissed, stepping closer. The gun lifted, now aimed squarely between her eyes. Chloe lifted her gaze from the register and met his, her expression unreadable. She let the silence stretch, just for a second. Let him feel the weight of it. Let him feel the eyes of the man in the corner. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, so low only he could hear it, she said, "Rico would be very disappointed in your form. He hates messes." The man flinched, as if she had struck him. It was a small movement, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders, but she saw it. Behind the mask, his eyes widened in shock and a flicker of genuine fear. He did not know her. He could not possibly know how she knew that name. "You don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but the conviction was gone from his voice. The gun wavered. "I know that the Ouroboros on your wrist means you answer to him," she continued, her voice still a low, steady murmur. "And I know that man in the corner booth is Dante Moretti. You are pointing a gun in Dante Moretti's territory, in Dante Moretti's line of sight. You are not just making a mess. You are starting a war over $187. Do you really think Rico wants that?" The robber's head snapped toward the corner booth. He finally seemed to see the man sitting there. Really see him. Dante hadn't moved a muscle, but his presence now filled the diner, suffocating the air. The shadows in his corner seemed to deepen, his face a mask of cold displeasure. He lifted his glass of whiskey slowly, deliberately, and took a small sip. The gesture was utterly mundane, yet it felt like a death sentence. The robber looked from Dante back to Chloe. The gun in his hand now felt impossibly heavy. The plastic bag trembled. He had come in here thinking he was a predator. He now understood he was nothing but bait. And the trap had just snapped shut around him. Without another word, he turned and fled. He didn't take the money. He just ran, bursting through the diner doors and disappearing into the night, the little bell above the door ringing frantically in his wake. For a long moment, the diner was utterly silent. Then a collective breath was released. Mrs. Gable started crying again, this time with relief. Chloe slowly, carefully, closed the cash drawer. Her hands were perfectly steady. She turned, her gaze sweeping over the few terrified customers, and then landed on the man in the corner. Dante Moretti. He was looking right at her. His expression was no longer unreadable. It was sharp, analytical, and deeply, deeply interested. He had heard every word she'd said. She knew it. She had survived the robbery. She had handled the man with the gun. But as she met the cold, assessing gaze of Dante Moretti, she had the distinct feeling that her real trouble had only just begun. The aftermath was a slow return to normalcy that felt entirely fake. The police came, took statements, and left with a shrug. A botched robbery. Nothing new. No one was hurt. No money was taken. They didn't ask the right questions. They didn't see the tattoo that wasn't there anymore, or the name that had hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. They didn't understand that the man in the corner booth, who gave his statement with quiet, clipped precision, was the real authority in the room. Chloe cleaned up. She wiped down the counter, refilled the salt shakers, and gave the remaining customers, the ones who hadn't fled, coffee on the house. Her movements were automatic, a familiar rhythm to soothe the frantic energy still buzzing under her skin. She kept her back to the corner booth, but she could feel his eyes on her, a weight against her spine. Finally, the last customer left. The cook, a burly man named Sal, grunted a good night and disappeared into the back. The bells on the door were silent. It was just her and Dante Moretti. She turned off the neon open sign, plunging the front of the diner into shadow. The only light came from the dim glow of the kitchen. She untied her apron, her fingers fumbling with the knot. She just wanted to go home, to lock her door, and pretend this night never happened. "You have a name?" His voice cut through the silence, deep and smooth, with no trace of the city in its accent. It was a voice that was used to being obeyed. "Chloe," she said, not turning around. She folded her apron and placed it on the counter. "Chloe," he repeated, and the way he said it was different. He tasted the syllables, made them his own. "You handled that situation with unusual calm." "I've worked late shifts for a long time," she lied. It was a weak lie, and they both knew it. "That was an experience," he said, his voice closer now. She hadn't heard him move, but he was no longer in the booth. He was standing a few feet behind her. She could smell the faint, clean scent of cedar and something else, something metallic and cold. That was knowledge. "You knew the name. You knew the tattoo. You knew who I was." She finally turned to face him. Up close, he was even more imposing. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his dark jacket. His face was all harsh angles and shadows, a severe jawline and a straight nose. A thin, white scar cut through his left eyebrow, a flaw in an otherwise perfect, severe face. His eyes were the darkest brown she had ever seen, so dark they were almost black. "I get a lot of customers," she said, her voice steady. "I hear things." He took another step, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head back to look at him. He didn't crowd her, but his proximity was a form of pressure.
"No.
You don't hear things like that working in a diner. You don't recognize a rival family's marker and use my name as a weapon unless you learned it somewhere else. So, you will tell me where." It wasn't a question. It was a command wrapped in silk. She could feel the power rolling off him, a palpable force. Her survival instincts, honed through a childhood she fought every day to forget, screamed at her to run. But she knew running was pointless. Men like him didn't let things go. "It doesn't matter," she said, her chin lifting.
He's gone."
"It's over." A flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed his face, but it never reached his eyes. "Over? You think this is over? That boy will go back to Rico. He will tell him that a waitress in a nothing diner knows their business. He will tell him she used my name to stop him. Rico will want to know who this waitress is. He will want to silence her before she can say anything else." His gaze was intense, pinning her in place. "You did not end anything tonight, Chloe. You just made yourself the main character in a story you do not want to be in." The truth of his words settled in her stomach like a block of ice. She had been so focused on de-escalating the immediate threat that she hadn't thought about the consequences. She had revealed her knowledge. She had linked herself to Dante Moretti in the mind of his enemy. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tight. "I want to know who you are. And until I do, you are a liability I have to manage." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. He didn't take out money. He took out a key. A single, simple brass key attached to a plain black fob. He placed it on the counter between them. It made a soft, final sound. "Lock up," he said. "You're coming with me." She stared at the key. It looked so ordinary, but she knew it was the key to a cage. She had spent her entire life running from this world, from men with scars and quiet voices that promised violence. She had built a small, anonymous life for herself. She worked, she paid her rent, she kept her head down. She thought she had escaped. But as she looked from the key to the unyielding darkness in Dante Moretti's eyes, she knew her escape had just been a temporary reprieve. The past she had tried so hard to bury had just broken through the surface. She thought she was just a waitress trying to get through another night. But now, she was something else entirely. She was his problem. And his problems did not have a habit of walking away. The ride was silent. The car was a large, black sedan with windows so heavily tinted that the city became a blur of muted colors and distant lights. It smelled of rich leather and his cedar cologne. Chloe sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap, watching the driver's impassive face in the rear-view mirror. Dante sat beside her, but he felt miles away. He stared out the window, his profile etched against the passing streetlights. He did not speak. He did not need to. The silence itself was a statement of control. They drove for what felt like an hour, crossing a bridge into a part of the city she didn't recognize. The buildings grew taller, sleeker, the streets cleaner and emptier. The car finally slipped into a private underground garage and came to a stop in a reserved spot. "Come," was all he said, getting out of the car. She followed him to a private elevator. There were no buttons, just a single slot for a key card which he produced from his pocket. The elevator ascended with a smooth, silent rush. Chloe's ears popped. When the doors opened, they did not open into a hallway. They opened directly into an apartment. Or rather, a penthouse. The space was enormous, a vast expanse of dark wood floors, minimalist furniture, and a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking, godlike view of the city skyline. It was cold, not in temperature, but in feeling. It was less a home and more a showroom, curated and impersonal. There were no photographs, no books left out, no sign that anyone actually lived here. It was a beautiful, empty cage. Dante walked to a wet bar built into one wall and poured himself the same amber liquid he'd had at the diner. He didn't offer her one. He turned, leaning against the bar, and finally looked at her. "My men are looking into you," he stated, his voice flat. "They will find out where you live, where you were born, who your parents were. They will be thorough. You can make it easier by simply telling me the truth. How do you know the name Rico Esposito?" Chloe wrapped her arms around herself. The air conditioning was high, but the chill she felt was deeper than that. "My father," she said, her voice quiet. "He used to be in the life. A long time ago." Dante's expression didn't change, but a new stillness settled over him. He was listening. "He was an associate," she continued. "Not important. He drove for people, ran errands. He worked under a capo, who answered to the Esposito family. And where is he now? Dead." The word was stark, stripped of emotion. "He made a mistake. He trusted the wrong person. The Espositos cleaned it up. They made him disappear. My mother and I were told to forget he ever existed." She had been 8 years old. She remembered the quiet men who came to their apartment, the way her mother had sobbed without making a sound. She remembered the sudden, terrifying emptiness of her father's side of the closet. She had learned early that this world did not forgive mistakes. Dante took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving her face. He was assessing her story, searching for the cracks. "You recognize the tattoo?" "My father had one," she said. "He told me it was a good luck charm. He said it meant you were part of a family that always had your back." He was wrong. The silence that followed was heavy with everything she hadn't said. The poverty that followed her father's disappearance, the struggle, the constant fear of being noticed by the people who had erased him. Her entire life had been an exercise in becoming invisible. And tonight, in one stupid, impulsive moment, she had lit a flare. "Your father was a fool to trust them," Dante said. "It wasn't an insult. It was a statement of fact. But you're not your father. You knew to use my name." "Why?" "Because the enemy of my enemy is my best chance of survival," she said, the words tasting like acid. "I knew who you were. Everyone on the street knows who the Moretti family is. I knew Rico Esposito was your rival. I gambled that the man with the gun would be more afraid of starting a war with you than he was of disobeying his boss." He pushed himself off the bar and walked toward the window, looking out at the glittering city below. "It was a calculated risk," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Intelligent. But it has put you in the center of that war." He turned back to her, his face half in shadow. "Rico cannot allow someone with your knowledge to be a free agent. He will assume you work for me now. He will come for you to get to me." Therefore, her life as she knew it was over. The small apartment she could barely afford, the job she hated, the fragile anonymity she had so carefully constructed. It was all gone, wiped away as cleanly as her father had been. Dante seemed to read the despair on her face. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He walked to a door she had noticed and opened it. "This will be your room. There are clothes in the closet. My housekeeper is your size. Don't try to leave. The elevator will not work without my key, and the stairs are alarmed." He was about to close the door when he stopped. He looked at her, his gaze intense. "There is one more thing. The man you spoke to at the diner. He wasn't just some soldier. The tattoo you saw, the Ouroboros, is for Rico's inner circle. That was his nephew. The floor seemed to drop out from under her. She hadn't just embarrassed a low-level thug. She had humiliated the head of the rival family's own blood. This was no longer just business. It was personal. He saw the understanding dawn on her face. He gave a single, sharp nod. Get some rest, Chloe. Tomorrow, the real work begins. He closed the door, leaving her alone in the silent, luxurious room. She stood there for a long time, the city lights painting patterns on the floor, feeling the cold, hard reality of the cage she was now in. She hadn't just been brought here for her own protection. She had been brought here because she was now a piece on the board. And Dante Moretti never wasted a piece. The days that followed blurred into a strange routine. Chloe existed within the sterile confines of the penthouse. A quiet, older woman named Sophia came each morning, bringing food and fresh clothes, her eyes kind but her mouth firmly shut. Chloe tried to ask her questions once, but Sophia had simply shaken her head and patted her hand, a gesture that was both comforting and a clear warning. Dante was a ghost. He would be gone when she woke up and would return late at night, long after she had gone to the guest room. But his presence was everywhere. In the scent of cedar that lingered in the air, in the way the silence in the apartment felt watchful, in the expensive, untouched food left for her in the refrigerator. He was keeping her, a specimen under glass. She spent her time reading from his surprisingly vast library and watching the city from the window. She felt like a ghost herself, haunting a life that wasn't hers. One evening, a week after the robbery, he came home early. She was in the living area, curled on a large gray sofa, reading a history of the Roman Empire. He stopped in the doorway, his suit jacket off, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to his forearms. She saw the intricate lines of a tattoo peeking out on his right arm, dark ink against his skin. He looked tired. There were faint shadows under his eyes. "What are you reading?" he asked, his voice low. "About strategy," she answered, not looking up from the page. "About how empires are won and lost." He walked over and looked down at the book. "They are lost through betrayal," he said, his voice holding a new, rougher edge. "Always. From the inside." He went to the bar and poured his drink. This time, he poured a second glass, with only ice and water, and set it on the coffee table in front of her. It was the first gesture he had made that was not a command or a statement of fact. A small, almost deniable kindness. She looked at the glass, then up at him. "Why am I still here, Dante?" He sat in the armchair opposite her, the space between them charged with a sudden tension. "Because Rico is hunting. He has his men sweeping every diner, every late-night dive in this city, looking for a waitress with your face. So, you're protecting me." "I am protecting an asset," he corrected her coolly. "You possess a rare quality. You see things as they are. You don't panic. That makes you useful." He paused, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "And you know what it is to lose a father to that world. You have no illusions about it." There was something in the way he said it, a darkness in his eyes that went beyond their color. It was a shared wound. She felt a sudden, unwelcome pang of connection to this cold, dangerous man. "You lost someone," she said. It wasn't a question. His jaw tightened. He stared down into his glass for a long moment before answering. "My brother." Angelo, his voice was flat, but she could hear the layers of grief and guilt beneath the surface. "He was younger than me. He wasn't like me. He was softer. He wanted to be a part of the family, to prove himself. I let him. I vouched for a man, brought him into our circle. I trusted him." Dante looked up, and his eyes were black holes of memory. "The man I trusted sold us out to Rico's father. He set up an ambush. I survived. Angelo did not." The story hung in the air between them, raw and bleeding. This was his wound. The betrayal he never recovered from. The failure he could never forgive himself for. It was the reason for his caution, his control, his cold assessment of everyone he met. He had made a mistake once, a mistake of trust, and it had cost him everything. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head, a sharp, dismissive gesture. Sorrow is useless. Vengeance is not. He finished his drink in one swallow. Rico wants to finish what his father started. He wants to dismantle everything I've built. And now he thinks you are a key to doing that. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor shifted. The weary man disappeared, replaced by the cold, lethal authority she had seen in the diner. "We have to move," he said, standing up. "There's been a breach. They know about this place." Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through Chloe's composure. "What? How?" "It doesn't matter how," he said, grabbing his jacket. "It only matters that we are no longer safe here." He came towards her, and for the first time, he reached out and touched her, his hand closing around her upper arm. His grip was firm, inescapable. "Stay close to me. Do exactly as I say." The touch sent a jolt through her, a strange mix of fear and something else. Something that felt disturbingly like safety. It was the first time she had been touched by anyone in over a week. She had a choice. She could scream. She could fight. She could make a scene. It would be useless, but it would be a choice. Or she could do as he said. She could trust that the most dangerous man she had ever met was her only path to survival. She looked into his dark, intense eyes and gave a single nod. She made a deliberate choice to stay, to trust him. Therefore, she was no longer just his prisoner or his asset. She was his ally. And in his world, that was the most dangerous thing to be of all.